Hi, it's my pleasure today to introduce you Chuck Greene, professor at Cornell University in the Department of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences. And today Chuck is going to introduce us to a very interesting concept of using marine microalgae for biofuels and also production of food. And so the title of his talk, in fact, is Marine Microalgae, Climate, Energy, and Food Security for the 21st Century. Thank you, Chuck. I'll let you begin.
So I'm going to start off with the question, what do we need to do globally to avoid catastrophic climate change? And I think, this question, we began to approach an answer to it with the Paris Climate Agreement, where we finally got, after many years of negotiations, almost all of the world's nations to sign on to the climate agreement. And the goal, or what these countries agreed upon, was to limit the increase in mean global temperature to no more than 2 degrees C relative to the pre-industrial levels, and to pursue additional efforts to limit the increase to below 1.5 degrees C. So that's what the policymakers set as their goals, and what that left the scientific community with the responsibility of is figuring out how we're going to achieve those goals. So this is from the IPCC report from a few years ago. And basically what we're looking at is the allowable cumulative carbon emissions to achieve the various target temperatures at the end of the current century. So this first set, this is directly from the IPCC report. And this is basically, if you want to hit 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, 2.5 degrees, 3 degrees, how much cumulative carbon emissions, or CO2 emissions rather, that you can emit. In the red, that's how much can be emitted from 2013 till 2049. And the gray corresponds to how much can be emitted in the second half of the century. And this first set of thermometers looks at the probability budgets where we basically have a 50-50 chance of hitting those targets. I don't know about you, but I sort of prefer having a higher probability. So this second set corresponds to an 80% probability of hitting those targets. And the reason why I prefer 80% is that I'm not so sure that I want to take a 50-50 chance of exceeding the temperature that's going to lead to catastrophic climate change. Now, one of the things so I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth here, and I'm going to focus on the 2 degree target. And what you'll see here is that basically to hit the 2 degree target with an 80% probability, we basically have about 886 gigatons of carbon dioxide that can be emitted in the first half of the century, and a very small amount that can be emitted during the second half of the century. If we wanted to hit 1.5 degrees with an 80% probability, we basically, we're beyond that without going to negative emissions. So if we look at that 2 degree target and look at where we're at, again, to hit that 886 gigatons of CO2, basically between 2000 and 2011, we had already burnt that much. So that meant that we had about 565 gigatons of CO2 that we could still emit between now and 2050 and still be on the trajectory towards that target. And then just to kind of put this into perspective, this is the current known global fossil fuel reserves. So as you can see, this is why basically, to me, it makes no more sense for us to be doing any kind of exploration for new fossil fuel reserves, because we already have 4 or 5 times the reserves that we need that we can actually burn without exceeding our targets. So what's the big difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees? It doesn't seem like much. It's only 0.5 degree C, but the IPCC just put out a special report that came out this fall, and it basically shows you that the difference is really quite large when you look at the impact. So if we're looking at extreme heat events, these ones that actually threaten human life, that'll become a little bit more than 2.5 times worse at 2 degrees relative to 1.5 degrees. If we look at species losses, so threats to biodiversity, you can see that the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees is about 2 to 3 times worse. If we look at coral reefs, it's basically the difference between destroying most of the coral reefs in the world and basically destroying all of the coral reefs in the world. And finally, if we look at fisheries production, again, this half degree difference in the ultimate target leads to a twofold change in or reduction in global fisheries. So if we want to achieve those goals of the Paris Agreement, we not only have to reduce CO2 emissions going forward, but we're going to actually have to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, which is referred to as negative emissions. And we're going to focus on carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, and that refers to the extraction of carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere and its long-term storage either underground, in geological repositories, in the ocean, in the terrestrial biosphere, or in the human-built environment. So the modelers with the IPCC came up with this idea of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which goes by the acronym BECCS. And this has sort of become the darling of the climate modelers because it's a fairly simple conceptual idea. The idea basically is that trees and other plants would take CO2 out of the atmosphere. We would then harvest that terrestrial biomass, burn it in a power plant to generate electricity and heat, and then we would capture the CO2 and sequester that CO2 in a geological repository. The problem with BECCS is that, while the modelers like it, they don't necessarily think about the real world implications. And there's a lot of other people in ecology and environmental sciences that recognize that BECCS leads to all sorts of other really critically important global challenges. Among them, it's going to require huge amounts of land. And that means that it will compete with agriculture for that land. And in addition, it's going to compete with agriculture and other parties that require fresh water. So the implications, the land and freshwater implications of BECCS are huge. It will encourage deforestation and subsequently biodiversity loss. So there's a lot of people that are very skeptical. This is a very controversial area. So are there other things that we can do globally? And what I want to focus on today is what I refer to as better living through algae. And I'm going to take you back about 15 years ago to what the general idea was about producing algal biomass on a large scale. So for the primary production of algae, you need sunlight, you need nutrients, and you need CO2. And the model back then, so one of the problems that we face is where are we going to get the CO2? And you might ask, well, we already have a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere, but the problem is we really don't. If we're at a little bit over 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, that really is a pretty dilute gas. And what's constraining algal growth, so if you want your algae really growing at high rates, you need to supply CO2 across the air-water interface of these algal ponds rapidly enough to keep up with how quickly the algae are taking it up. And basically, you run into this bottleneck in that the CO2 can't diffuse through that air-water interface as rapidly as the algae take it up. So the idea was that we would capture CO2 from power plants to provide, and then bubble that in to our ponds, and that's the way we've been doing things for a while. Once you produce the algal biomass, you can process it and do all sorts of things with it. You can take the proteins and produce animal feeds. Potentially human nutrition can be addressed as well. You can take the oils and you can produce biodiesel and jet fuel. You can also produce bioplastics and other biopetroleum-based products, which I think is really interesting. You can take the carbohydrates and produce ethanol, or you could burn that algae in your power plant, but that wouldn't be a particularly smart thing to do because that algae is expensive to make, it's valuable, and you really just don't want to burn it in a power plant. Now, the problem with this approach is that if you are using a power plant that is a fossil-fired power plant, then basically you're not really solving the CO2 problem, because especially when you're trying to produce fuels, because when you subsequently burn that, you're going to end up releasing that CO2 in the atmosphere. So basically, you're just going to get one more cycle out of that fossil carbon before it ends up in the atmosphere. The other thing too is if you're getting your electricity to run the power plant from the grid, and you're not using entirely renewable sources, that's also increasing your carbon footprint. So the other thing that we started thinking about was algal biomass production, where we combine it with direct air capture. So this way we cut the power plant out of the picture, and we look at some of the ways that we can do direct air capture of CO2 from the atmosphere. So there's two companies that are making quite a bit of progress in North America. One in Canada is Carbon Engineering, led by David Keith from Harvard. Global Thermostat is another company. Peter Eisenberger is one of the leads on that from Columbia. And I believe actually there at Georgia Tech, there are people that are looking into working with Global Thermostat as a provider of CO2 for algae. So the benefits of this is that now that you're getting your CO2 directly from the atmosphere, you actually have the potential to really produce carbon neutral fuels, because your CO2 is from the atmosphere. When you burn those fuels, it's just going back into the atmosphere and not introducing any new fossil carbon. Problem is that these are really sort of still in their early stages of development. Direct air capture is still pretty expensive. We're hoping that in a decade or so, we can get the cost down to maybe $50 per metric ton of CO2. At that point, it really becomes something that becomes economically viable. And again, you actually can capture more CO2 than you need for your algae. You can sequester some of that, and then you're actually being carbon negative. And of course, if you can provide your electricity from renewables, that also doesn't increase your carbon footprint. And I actually put concentrated solar here because I think that's a really exciting possibility to combine with direct air capture. And the reason I say that is that for Global Thermostat's technology, they use industrial waste heat as a source of energy to drive their direct air capture system. And the way concentrated solar works is it concentrates that solar energy on a tube with a working fluid in it, which basically heats that fluid up. So there you have a source of not only electricity, but also a source of heat that could be used to drive the direct air capture. Not to be forgotten, let's get back to this idea about BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And because this is something that a lot of people are talking about, it is controversial, we decided to play some games and see what could happen if we combined it with algal biomass production. So what we do now is we basically take a terrestrial biomass source. In the model that we explored in our paper, we looked at eucalyptus, and as you might, I'm talking to you from Hawaii now, And we grow algae on the leeward side of the island, which gets lots of sunshine, but the windward side of the island gets a lot of rain. And there's eucalyptus plantations there. Eucalyptus grows incredibly rapidly. So in a place like Hawaii, you could actually do something with eucalyptus and algae, and the transportation costs are not prohibitively expensive. So the idea here is that you now grow eucalyptus, you burn that in your power plant, and then you capture that CO2, sequester some of it, and the rest of it you can use in the algae production. And of course, you can generate your electricity for the power plant by burning this eucalyptus as well. So this can be a pretty self-contained solution. And in this paper that we published in Earth's Future, integrating algae with BECCS, and we talked about how it can increase sustainability, we went through this argument where we said, okay, let's look at what happens if we take 2,800 hectares of soy cropland and replace that with an integrated ABECCS system where we devote 2,680 hectares to eucalyptus forest and 120 hectares to marine algae production. And if we do that, this eucalyptus-fired power plant can provide all the CO2 that we need for the algae production, as well as the electricity. And at the same time, this integrated 2,800 hectare ABECCS system produces as much protein as the soy cropland. And it's also, this protein is actually much more nutritious than soy. It has much more complex amino acid composition. It has omega-3 fatty acids and a number of other oils that are also make it much more nutritious. And again, because we're working with marine microalgae, we don't actually increase the land or freshwater demand relative to the soy. And at the same time, we can produce 61.5 terajoules of electricity, while at the same time sequestering 29,600 tons of CO2 per year. So, how expensive is this? Well, it turns out that the system can actually be economically viable if you can get about $1,400 per ton of the algae as a fish meal replacement and get about a $68 per ton CO2 carbon credit. So basically fish meal, the commodity market is in the $1,300 to $1,500 per ton range right now. So that's not unreasonable. Obviously, you can't get $68 per ton of CO2 now, but hopefully in the not too distant future, we will be seeing carbon credits like that. And of course, this is all with scaling up existing technology and doesn't take into account improvements which will undoubtedly bring the costs down. So let's take a look at a research and development facility that we've been working at. This is the Kona demonstration facility. It's here near the airport in Kona, Hawaii. We're looking down in an aerial view now. These are the open raceway ponds, and this is where the photobioreactors are. So these are what the photobioreactors look like here, and this is what the open raceway ponds look like here. And what I want you to realize, these photobioreactors are a closed system. They're big plastic tubes, and basically you continuously culture your algae in these, and they provide the inoculum that you then use to inoculate these raceway ponds. We only grow the algae in the raceway ponds for 2 days before we harvest them. That way we can prevent any kind of contamination. And we grow the algae more continuously in these photobioreactors because, again, if you don't grow algae in a closed system and they're open to the outside for long periods of time, they can get contaminated by either grazers or other algae that are not as attractive and can outcompete them. So we use this hybrid approach that combines both the photobioreactors as well as the open raceway ponds. So what are the advantages of marine microalgae? Well, first of all, they're very productive. So if we go down and look at a comparison of the yield of oils from various feedstocks, and we look at soy, jatropha, palm oil, and algae, we can see that the algae, so these are target yields that the DOE has set up for fiscal year 14, 18, 20, and 22. I'll just point out that in 2015, we already hit this fiscal year 20 DOE target. So we're already here and going quickly approaching the fiscal year 2022 target. But as you can see, this yield is typically 1 to 2 orders of magnitude higher than these terrestrial, fast-growing by terrestrial standard energy crops. The other thing is, because we're growing marine microalgae, we can do it on non-productive, non-arable land. The Kona demonstration facility I showed you is actually on a lava bed, and it's in a desert. There's less than 10 inches of rainfall a year there. So that means that we don't have to compete for cropland. We don't have to compete with agriculture for land. We also, because they're a marine alga, or they're a variety of marine algae, we don't have to compete with agriculture for fresh water. So that's another really big advantage, is in the parts of the world that we're likely to see this industry be successful. There's also no fertilizer runoff and associated downstream eutrophication that we typically see with our traditional agriculture. That's because basically all of the nutrients that we add while we are cultivating the algae basically get taken up, and the only nutrients that we actually lose are the ones that are actually in the products that we're producing. And finally, we can produce foods, fuels, and other valuable co-products. And so what I want to do is, I believe I sent you this paper to read on climate, energy, and food security from the sea. And in this, we really started to ask, what if we take our results from the Kona demonstration facility and try to scale them up globally, where do we get to? And basically, we did these, what I call back of the envelope calculations. And we look at in the first example, we look at the 2016 total liquid fuel demand of the United States, which was about 19.6 million barrels per day. And then we look at the assumed productivity from our data at the Kona demonstration facility, which is about half a barrel per hectare per day. And what you basically come up with is that you need about 392,000 square kilometers, which corresponds to about 4% of the U.S. land area, about half the size of Texas, where if you cultivate algae in that area, you can meet this U.S. demand. If we then look at the global total liquid fuel demand, which is about 5 times that of the United States, 96 million barrels per day, and calculate the same way the land requirement for that, it comes out to about 1.92 million square kilometers. That corresponds to 21% of the U.S. land area, which is slightly less than 3 times the size of Texas. Now, I only talk about U.S. land area and size of Texas because those are things that are familiar to people, but it's unlikely that most of this algae cultivation is actually going to occur in the United States. It's going to occur in other parts of the world, and I'll show you where in a little bit. But one of the other interesting things that came out of these back of the envelope calculations, as I said, okay, what happens if we look at the land that we're going to need to meet those liquid fuel demands? How much protein do we simultaneously produce? So basically you harvest that algal biomass, you extract the lipids, the oils that you need to produce the fuels, and then you're left with what we call the defatted algal biomass. Now, how much protein is in that defatted algal biomass? Well, it turns out that to meet the U.S. liquid fuel demand, you simultaneously produce about 2 times the global soybean protein production. And again, as I mentioned before, it's actually a higher quality protein. If we look at the simultaneous production of this defatted algal biomass to meet the global liquid fuel demand, we actually produce 10 times the global soy protein production. So going through this calculation really was an eye-opener for us, because what we recognized was that really, while we were looking for ways to produce fuels and produce food, initially we were looking for fuels, we realized that we have the potential to really solve the problem of where the world is going to get enough protein to meet the needs of the 10 billion people that are going to be on the planet by the middle of this century. So this is the global vision. What we are looking at here is a map showing the potential productivity of liquid algal fuels around the world. And what you can see is it's the arid subtropical regions of the world where the productivity is really high. And so to give you a sense of scale here, here's Texas. And remember, to meet the global liquid fuel need, you need to cultivate algae in an area about 3 times the size of Texas. So you can see there's plenty of areas in the world. Many of these areas are deserts. Many of them are not suitable for agriculture, which is great because it means that we don't have to compete with agriculture. Now, I should point out that not all of that land is actually available to us. We actually have to be within about 10 kilometers of the ocean or some other brackish or marine source of water, because otherwise the cost of transporting that seawater or brackish water becomes prohibitively expensive. So what we're really looking at are the coastlines of these subtropical regions. But you can see places like northern Australia. We're actually in talks with people in Peru now. You can see many parts of Africa are really ripe for this type of industry. And this is kind of our vision of what a facility would look like, stretching off to the horizon with our photobioreactors and with our raceway ponds, and close enough to the coast, but actually potentially in a coastal desert where we don't have to compete with agriculture. So what are the key points here? So if we're looking at this large-scale industrial cultivation of marine microalgae on land, it can provide society with an environmentally favorable approach to help us meet the Paris climate goals. It can help us produce the liquid hydrocarbon fuels required for jet aviation, shipping, and heavy vehicles. When we started this, of course, people were interested in biofuels, algal biofuels, and other biofuels to potentially help service the light vehicle transportation sector, like cars. But actually, as we look forward, we see that over the next few decades, it's likely that the light vehicle fleet will be completely electrified. So that will no longer be a problem for us. That will be for other people to deal with in producing that electricity with as small a carbon footprint as possible. But jet aviation and shipping are areas in the transportation sector where we still are likely to need liquid fuels. We also have the potential to produce carbon negative, long-lived biopetroleum products that will actually help us reduce the atmospheric CO2. And one of the things that I'm hoping there'll be a major expansion in is using the biopetroleum products in the human-built environment. Right now, there's not a huge huge industrial demand for petroleum products, at least not on the scale that's needed to sequester CO2. But one can imagine a future where we actually replace steel with carbon fiber. We replace a lot of our building products with plastics and other kinds of products like that. Maybe also strengthening our wood products with epoxies and other things that will enable us to really create a very large market, so that rather than sequestering CO2 underground, which just comes at a cost, we actually create markets that actually return some revenue to this fairly expensive process. Again, we see this as providing the protein that will be necessary to feed a global population approaching 10 billion people by 2050. And then one of the things that I think is really important, and we hadn't anticipated when we first got into this, is that this provides a means to reduce the land demand for food and fuel production. And that enables us to avoid the CO2 emissions associated with land use change. So remember back when we talked about how algae is 1 to 2 orders of magnitude more productive than the fastest growing terrestrial land plants. Well, what that means is that you can actually produce the same amount of food and fuel from 1/10 to 1/100th the area. So obviously we can reduce the demand for land. So when we look at places like the Amazon now, where they're basically deforesting it in order to increase soy production, or if we look at in Indonesia, where they're tearing down their rainforests in order to expand palm oil plantations, well, we can avoid that. We can take the pressure off of those rainforests, and that's incredibly important because those rainforests store a tremendous amount of CO2, and whenever we transition them into soy cropland or into palm oil plantations, we release a tremendous amount of CO2 into the atmosphere. So we really think that these changes in land use can actually be one of the most important positive impacts that we can have on addressing the climate change issue. So that's what I wanted to sort of introduce to you, and I know that you have some people there that want to talk for a little while, and then I'm happy to then answer questions and also address some of the challenges we face. So I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Chuck.